After 15 months of fighting, a ceasefire in Gaza appears to be imminent, with final talks underway in Qatar. Joining me today to discuss this and more are Jake Wallace-Simons and Paul Wood. So with the ceasefire deal imminent, I understand it's going to be in 3 stages. Jake, perhaps you could outline what those 3 stages might be.
Sure. Well, phase 1 will involve Israel beginning its withdrawal from the main population centres in Gaza and allowing the Palestinians who are directed towards the south for their own safety to begin to return to the north of Gaza. There'll be a surge in aid as well, with 600 aid trucks promised a day. And in return, there'll be 33 hostages released. And the belief is that most, if not all of them, will be alive. And these will be women, children, the elderly, and the wounded. And it's thought to include 5 female soldiers. And we believe Emily Damari, the British hostage, the Spurs fan, 28-year-old Spurs fan, is likely to be released as well. And of course, without forgetting the prisoners who are going to be released, the Palestinian prisoners. We haven't got a number on that yet, but it's likely to be about 50 per female soldier. Including about 30 who are doing life sentences. These are all convicted murderers and terrorists that are due to be released, some of which are, we think, going to be exiled to Qatar or Turkey, but most of them will go back to Gaza. Phase 2, after this 6-week period, will be that Hamas releases the remaining living captives, which will mainly be male soldiers, in exchange for a complete withdrawal from Gaza, and some more prisoners, Palestinian prisoners, released as well. And phase 3 is likely to be the bodies of dead hostages being returned in exchange for a 3 to 5 year international reconstruction plan for Gaza.
And Paul, what do you think that reconstruction plan might look like?
Well, we've had precious little detail on that. I think the fundamental and most important point here is that parts of Gaza, most of Gaza, may have been reduced to rubble, but it's rubble, at least in the south, that Hamas will still control. By some historical coincidence, we had the death of Jimmy Carter, President Carter, at the age of 100, a few days ago. And his press secretary was speaking in his obit saying that for each one of the 444 days that the American hostages were held in Tehran, President Carter worked on the hostage crisis, often to the exclusion of everything else. And I thought, that's a bit of a contrast with Benjamin Netanyahu. He may certainly care about the hostages, but he did not allow the hostages to deflect his policy. The policy being to not just to cripple Hamas, but in the words that he used at the beginning of the conflict, to destroy Hamas completely. Now, you can call that statesmanship. You can call it something else. Certainly some of the hostage families thought it was the act of a weak leader who needed a war to stay in power. But for all this time, since the October the 7th massacres more than a year ago, Israel has pursued its war aims while attempting to negotiate with Hamas, while at the same time trying to destroy it. This apparently was the same deal on the table in May. So what's changed? Has Netanyahu achieved his war aims? I don't think so. I think this is down to the Trump effect and Trump sending his special envoy, not just to threaten Hamas, but I think to threaten Netanyahu. We don't know all the details, but I think these are the questions we need to be asking now about how the deal was done and what's the small print in it. Does it allow Israel to go back into Gaza? I suspect it does.
And just on the theme of Trump, how do you see a Trump presidency affecting the Middle East, Jake?
Well, Trump is nothing if not unpredictable, of course. But as Paul was saying, his threats to open the gates of hell on Hamas if the hostages were still there once he comes into office on Monday certainly had a profound effect on galvanizing both sides to come to this deal before he takes office. The other element which is relevant to this, I think, is the internal Israeli politics. Over the last year and a bit, there's been a sense or a suspicion, particularly amongst the left, that Benjamin Netanyahu has been prolonging the war, refusing to do a deal, because if he were to accept a deal, then the far-right members of his coalition would bolt the coalition, collapsing his government. So they were holding his feet over the fire, if you like. Well, in September, he introduced another coalition member, Gideon Saar from the New Hope Party, which diluted the far-right's influence enough to allow him to do this deal without them having the whip hand over him. So there's that as well. But I think overall, in the bigger picture, there are a lot of people in Israel who are hopeful about a Trump administration, the effect it will have on the Middle East because, we saw that interview that Antony Blinken, the American Secretary of State, gave to the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, in which he admitted that Hamas were emboldened and rejected deals when there was a perception of daylight between America and Israel. And that daylight didn't come from nowhere. It came from the rhetoric of President Biden, who made public his hostility towards Israel at certain key points in the negotiations and ended up at some points criticizing Israel more than he criticized Hamas. And that allowed Hamas to think, well, if that alliance is fraying against us, then we've got the potential to play hardball. I don't think we'll see that with Trump as much. I mean, he's famously volatile. He will lash out perhaps at Netanyahu sometimes, but we hope or we expect that it's likely, I'm choosing my words carefully with Trump, that he'll be more likely to be shoulder to shoulder with his allies in the Middle East and take a more aggressive stance against the jihadis who threaten them.
As ever with Trump, it could go either way. He is above all a deal maker. Maybe he wants to do a deal in the Middle East, which would involve a Saudi-Israeli rapprochement. Maybe that's a Nobel Prize for Trump, who knows? But the Saudis want a Palestinian state. To have that Palestinian state, you need to get Israeli settlers out of the West Bank. Trump, who calls himself Israel's greatest defender, would be at loggerheads with most Israeli governments and certainly a Netanyahu government if that was the deal on the table. On the other hand, he's appointed a new ambassador to Israel who's famously supportive of settlements in the West Bank. And before we even get to that, I suspect a crisis of some kind will happen with Iran. Iran now has lost Hezbollah, which was what everybody called its strategic deterrent. What's it going to use instead? Well, perhaps this will be the dash to the nuclear weapon that the Iranians are often accused of making. Israel won't stand for that, and maybe in Trump they'll find an Israeli president who will allow them to bomb the nuclear sites, the oil installations, and things like that. So I think we're going to be in for a wild ride, a very unexpected time in the Middle East. It's not necessarily peace, I'm afraid, now that this Gaza hostage deal seems to have been done.
Paul, just on the Iranians, how do you see their perspective changing with the Trump administration? I mean, in recent weeks, it seems like their rhetoric has cooled down somewhat from where it was at 6 months ago. But you think they may sort of up gears again later on this year?
Well, don't forget it was President Trump who pulled out of the nuclear deal. He thought it was a sham, and people around him thought it was a sham, and funded Iranian efforts to create proxies around the region, Hamas and Hezbollah. Will we get another deal? Very unlikely. And the question is, how will the US and Israel stop what they believe is an Iranian nuclear program, which is very, very close to getting a working weapon? Israel, I think, will be emboldened. All the gambles that Mr. Netanyahu made, attacking Hezbollah, for instance, have paid off. We may even see a joint US-Israeli attack on Iran. The Iranians seem cowed for the moment. The rhetoric is as tough as ever. And let's not forget, they've twice carried out a direct attack on Israel, something that's never happened before. But I think they are cowed for the moment and realizing this is a very, very dangerous moment for them. And not least because, as Jake was saying, Trump's mercurial. You never know what he's going to do next. And of course, he uses that. That's part of his negotiating strategy, threatening Hamas with hell, threatening privately, Lord knows what, to Netanyahu. And that seems to be what's moved this process on. You often, with Trump, have to look at what he's saying and then expect him to do literally the opposite. It's a negotiating tactic.
I think it's important to recognise how weakened the Iranian regime is by comparison to this time last year. We've seen Hezbollah almost completely or largely destroyed. We've seen Hamas largely destroyed. We've seen Assad falling. And of course, the Iranian air defences were taken out by Israeli missiles in October last year, leaving them very, very vulnerable indeed. And as we know, Russia is busy elsewhere. So Iran has never been less vulnerable, or at least not in modern times. And all it's got left really is its nuclear program. And it understands that it's vulnerable to Israeli and perhaps American bombs on that score as well. So I think that the big loser of last year in the region certainly was the Ayatollah. But in terms of the relationship between Trump and Netanyahu, it's been volatile. I mean, we're learning about Trump and about Musk, indeed, that they can turn on their allies on a sixpence, as we saw with Musk insulting Farage just a couple of weeks after welcoming him in America. And Trump did a similar thing with Netanyahu. They were bosom buddies when Trump was in his first term. In fact, in Israel, northern Israel, there's even a village named after Trump. That's how close they were. But then when Bibi, as he's nicknamed, congratulated Joe Biden on his election win, Trump turned on Netanyahu. So, but they've since sort of made up. So you never really quite know what the interpersonal relationships are going to be like between these huge egos, these big beasts of the world stage. But certainly it seems more likely than not that the Trump agenda in the Middle East will align more closely with the Netanyahu agenda than Biden's did. And as Paul alluded to, the Abraham Accords, there's a big seat at the table open there, waiting for the Saudis to join. I'm less convinced than Paul about how much a Palestinian state could prove a sticking point for the Saudis. They might find a way around that, of watering that down and joining anyway, but time will tell. But certainly between the two of them, Trump and Netanyahu, I think we'll see friction, ups and downs, but ultimately they're more aligned than Biden and Bibi were.
And in terms of Netanyahu back home in a sort of domestic standing, how vulnerable is he going to be once the ceasefire deal is completed? He's been a wartime prime minister, but his coalition could now be shaky, or do you see him sort of staying for the long haul now?
Well, I mean, there are elections coming up, of course, next year, I believe. So he hasn't got that much longer before he has to face the public again, inevitably. I think that he's obviously dealing with the corruption trial, which was suspended recently to allow him to have prostate surgery. So there's that that's going to be reprised as well. His coalition is slightly stronger because the far-right members, Ben Gvir and Smotrich, no longer quite have the same level of veto power as they did as a result of Gideon Sa'ar joining last September, as I mentioned earlier. I think the main characteristic of Netanyahu is that he is the most unbelievable political survivor. There's nothing that it seems that he can't survive. And that will be certainly put to the test once the war is over, because then there'll be the almighty reckoning about what went wrong on October the 7th to allow such a catastrophe to hit the Jewish state. And of course, that was the culmination of many, many years of Netanyahu rule, where he presided over what was called in Israel the concept of containing Hamas and other enemies over the border while pursuing domestic economic development at home. And that was shown to be very, very flawed indeed on October the 7th, when Hamas were able to break through the border. And so certainly Netanyahu does carry a lot of the responsibility for that. But let's wait and see what the inquiry turns up. In Israel, a week is a lifetime in politics. And when Netanyahu is concerned, he's survived so much. The polls were dipping so much after October the 7th, they then came back up in his favour. So I think he's down, but certainly not out.
And Paul, what is actually now left of Hamas? I mean, obviously their top tier leadership have all basically been taken out. I mean, is it just a few guerrilla fighters left, or are there enough people there to sort of regroup and rule the Gaza Strip again?
I think Hamas can certainly regroup. Even if you killed every single Hamas member, those Hamas members would have sons or brothers or cousins who would step forward. Israel may have won a tactical victory here. Certainly, whenever the IDF comes face to face with Hamas, it's Hamas which is worst off. But if you look at the generational struggle, I don't know whether we believe that 44,000 people have been killed in Gaza and how many of those are fighters, but a lot of civilians have been killed in Gaza. Some people are angry, direct their anger towards Hamas because of that, but a lot of people are bent on vengeance. And so in 10 or 15 years' time, Hamas will be back. They're back now. I think something like 10 Israeli soldiers were killed over the past week by Hamas fighters who were taking unexploded bombs dropped from the air, rewiring them and making IEDs out of them. It's almost impossible to destroy a guerrilla army. The conventional army loses by not winning. The guerrilla army wins by not losing. And then in the generational struggle, you have a lot of people bent on revenge. So this is a temporary and tactical victory for Israel, nothing more than that, I'm afraid.
And who do you envision sort of ruling officially the Gaza Strip? I mean, will it be Fatah, the Palestinian Authority? I mean, presumably the Israelis are not going to allow Hamas as an official body to be taking charge again.
Well, this is one of the great unanswered questions of this deal. The Israeli military does not want to occupy Gaza. It doesn't have the manpower for it. It was no less a figure than Ariel Sharon who decided that was untenable and withdrew from Gaza. Hardliners in the Israeli government don't want Fatah than the Palestinian Authority back. So it's a question really of whether their influence has been diluted sufficiently for that to happen. And it's very difficult for the Palestinian Authority to be seen riding in behind Israeli tanks, literally or figuratively. There was some talk about different Gaza clans being invited by Israel to take a hand in ruling Gaza. One of those clans, I remember, was involved in kidnapping a former BBC colleague of mine under the guise of Al-Qaeda. So whether these clans were using the Al-Qaeda flag to mask regular criminal enterprise or what, I don't know. But it might not necessarily be better than Hamas, whatever comes afterwards. So that's quite chaotic, really. Would there be an Arab peacekeeping force of some kind? None of these details have been worked out. For the time being, we just have to get through the next couple of weeks between the first lot of hostages being released and the second lot of hostages being released before the ceasefire breaks down. But to return to this question of the inquiry that has been forestalled by the war, the inquiry starts. They might look at what's happened between May, when the same deal was put by Biden, and today. Have things changed so much? And if they haven't, that's a lot of Palestinian civilians killed. That's a lot of Israeli soldiers killed for a deal that Mr. Netanyahu could have accepted last May.
Of course, one thing that we have seen in terms of Israeli military gains was the killing of Yahya Sinwar and the taking of Rafah and the securing of the Philadelphia corridor in the south. These things were vital strategic gains in the war. They enabled the Israelis to cut off the smuggling lifeline. The smuggling tunnels all come into Rafah in the south, enabled Israel to kill Hamas's iconic leader, and of course to rout out the last sort of fortress of Hamas in Rafah. And now, as Paul pointed out, Hamas it resembles a guerrilla force rather than a sort of light infantry, which was what Israel faced in the beginning of the war. And in that way, Israel has been following the plan that it laid out right at the start of hostilities, which were airstrikes, ground invasion, mopping up a guerrilla force. But as Paul correctly pointed out, nobody knows what the day after is going to look like, even a year and a bit since the war began. And that is a serious problem, because if you can't put something else in place, then Hamas or some other terror group will inevitably fill that vacuum. So that's the big question we're all facing right now.
It's interesting that the Israelis have had 15 months to, worry about the day after the war. It seems strange that there wouldn't be more sort of strategic knowledge about what the strategy is, or is it just a case that it isn't being shared with the public?
Well, I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that it's just a very, very difficult problem to solve. As Paul mentioned, the Palestinian leadership is on the West Bank is very weak, very corrupt, and very inept, and would be unwilling probably to ride in behind Israeli tanks into Gaza, and would probably face some stiff resistance from Hamas and Hamas sympathizers in Gaza. But if not them, then whom? You can't occupy the Strip again from an Israeli point of view. I don't see any Arab powers stepping forward to take control of Gaza in a coalition. So it's a very difficult problem to solve. But the other element, of course, is the political one. And over the last year and a bit, the far right have had control over Netanyahu's coalition, and they do not want to see any kind of Palestinian self-rule in Gaza. In fact, many of them want to see Gaza reoccupied by Israel, which is not what the majority opinion is in Israel by any stretch. But they've got this disproportionate power because they are kingmakers in the coalition. And there's some truth, I think, in the fact that that's delayed a deal from being done, and has also delayed any kind of planning for the day after in Gaza.
And Paul, just very quickly, on sort of away from the actual ruling of the Gaza Strip on the day after the war ends, who's going to be funding the rebuilding of Gaza, and how might that affect the sort of geopolitics of the region?
Well, the hat will be passed round in a way that it often is for these kinds of appeals. The UN, which will do its own fundraising, the EU. But I think a country like Qatar will be central to this. They have been central to the negotiations. They were funding Hamas before, with Mr. Netanyahu's blessing. It's one of the things the inquiry is going to be looking into. But I think the immediate Arab neighbours, like Qatar, they will be the ones, and it's going to be huge. Look at the pictures coming out of Gaza. Street after street just flattened. There's an immense amount of rebuilding to do. And I think, however deep the pockets of a country like Qatar, this is not going to be easy or quick. It's going to be years before anything like the Gaza that was there before is restored. And of course, you can't replace all the lives lost.
Thank you very much for joining us today.